What is it that is actually going to help you move the needle down the line in the most effective way on your podcast? And how do you create a podcast that stays relevant and helps you achieve your podcast goals and serves your audience? Well, that's exactly what I'm covering in this podcast. And in this week's episode, I am recording not from home, but on the road. I will share with you and be honest that I had some tech issues and I had content pre recorded that ended up not being usable. And so here I am showcasing, leading by example, that the conditions don't need to be perfect in order for you to create value. So this week's episode is going to be a little shorter, but I promise that it's going to be packed in values. So listen all the way to the end because I'm going to reveal the one thing, the one truth about podcasting that most podcast experts will not tell you, but it's actually the key to growing your show. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm a podcast marketing expert, and in this podcast, I help you elevate your podcast, get more opportunities, get visible online, and grow your business and hit your podcast goals. Let's dive into this week's episode of the Podcast Space. Gotta be honest, this is not my optimal, my suggested, my recommended, or my preferred way to create a podcast episode. But I want to challenge myself and yourself into creating high quality content that may not be exactly what you want, but it's what allows us to stay consistent. That's number one reason why podcasts build an audience is because they're telling you, the listener, hey, this is when you're going to get a new episode. This is the value you're going to get. And so focusing on the value is really important to build a podcast that is still relevant. And far too often I talk about the importance of removing your ego and focusing on what really needs to happen. And to me, my brain and my ethics, I love well-designed and beautiful spaces. In a hotel, that is never what you get. Normally, most hotels are very gray, very bland. And I'm, getting over myself and recording this podcast episode as a video, experimenting with the constraints that I have and turning that into an opportunity. So a huge thing that happens as a podcaster long term is that you're going to feel like you're either stuck or the content is stale or you're not feeling excited about creating content. Challenging ourselves and asking ourselves, how can I incorporate excitement? How can I incorporate things that are going to help my audience but help me grow as a thought leader? Those are the things that help you stay motivated in the long run and create products that are exciting and relevant, and you're pushing the envelope on each episode that you're recording. So in this case, can I create a decent professional looking background as I'm recording this episode? Sure, why not? And when we're creating podcast episodes that showcase us as an expert, sometimes we get too hung up on the details of like the status quo. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. And sure, is this look my favorite look? No, but I am incorporating some elements of design. I kind of like move the chair around. I'm like, okay, this is good. This is all right. Not the most beautiful setup I would have, especially when I was creating the spaces for video podcasts, but it works. So ask yourself, when you're doing anything about your podcast, is this podcast creating value and creating a connection and creating an outcome for you and your business and future self? Or is this based on your fears of the present, right? Like what you think you have to deliver. So ask yourself that. And something super, super important that I want you to really tell yourself every time you're creating a podcast is, this is a marathon. This isn't a sprint. And one of the most important elements of it is creating a podcast that is also adjusted with the seasons. So there'll be people who will create podcast strategies for the whole year. And there'll be people who will have no plan at all. I fall in the middle. And for small business owners or impact-driven professionals, the way that we live our lives as humanity, the way technology evolves, I have not been able to safely say whatever you determine in the beginning of the year in January will still make sense in December. So I advise against having a content strategy that is like planned out, you don't budge, and that is, like 52 episode ideas. Sure, you can create a podcast plan, and I have a depository of ideas, and I have interviews that I'm recording through time that I'm not necessarily releasing right away. However, we have to leave room for what is happening. What is happening that's changing our industry, what is happening that is changing the way we do business, and what is happening that is changing our listeners' lives that we either have a solution for or that we are uniquely equipped to help them through that. So, when you're creating a podcast that is relevant, you are doing social listening throughout, right? And so I have a podcast episode that talks about how to anticipate your listeners' needs. And I will include that in the show notes because I think it's relevant. But really it's about how can I create a podcast content strategy that's serving me as a business owner or thought leader, and that is helping my community right now. Because if in 6 months' time you're talking about things that your audience is struggling with, they're going to be like, hey, you're late to the party. And as creatives, primarily the clients that I serve, you're probably listening and you fall onto this category of being a neurodivergent or someone who has squirrel brain. You feel very overwhelmed with having no strategy at all and just trying to figure it out. But you also feel very bored if your content strategy has been mapped out for so long that you're a different person and your business goals have changed. So the goal here is to create a content strategy that has, ideas, but you have to keep your content pillars at hand. And what I mean by this is, and I have a podcast episode on content pillars as well, which I'll link to that, but you have to determine what content pillar does this idea fall under. And so that allows you to have some flexibility. And again, an example, if you're thinking, okay, give me examples because I'm not sure I can figure it out. On this podcast, I talk about strategies to grow your listener intimacy, right? The connection that your listeners have to you, practical ways to grow your podcast downloads, and how to grow your online authority through using a podcast. So, what to track on your podcast, how to look at analytics and understand that, looking at analytics from your podcast hosting platform and also social media platforms, and how to turn those into insights. And I talk about mindset as well, because you can have all the strategy in the world, but if you don't believe that your podcast is worthy of growing, if you don't think that you're worthy of taking space as a thought leader, none of the things that you're going to be implementing are going to be having any impact, because you're going to show up as someone who is like, well, I don't want to, meh, it's not for me. And you're going to just second guess yourself all the time. And so the mindset is a very important element. And in my 15 plus years of producing podcasts and supporting business owners, I always see the ones that are the most successful are the ones that have taken the step of saying, hey, I deserve to take space. And so deserving to take space is also deserving to change the goals of the podcast if the need arises. And again, I'm not saying that you need to create a podcast strategy and throw it out the window every other quarter because, you're like, oh, I want to change everything. Your podcast needs to have a combination of evergreen content and content that can be swapped out if needed. Because let's think about it. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, honestly, 5 years ago, technology evolved a bit slower than it does today. And user behaviors, listener behaviors, and people's behaviors have changed too. However, you need to be able to prioritize, right? You need to prioritize listener needs and your needs, because if you run a business, you need to give priority to your own goals. And so I want to ask you something else, which is, has your podcast been doing what you want it to do? And if it hasn't, it's time to sit down and look at the numbers or hire a professional like me to delve into the why. And often people ask me, oh my gosh, your show is so great. How many people do you convert from listeners to customers? And I say, not many. The ones that I have converted have been to high ticket items. So case studies have been the situation where listeners are listening to a former client or a current client talk about their experience. and they become a client. But the majority of my content serves two purposes. One, serves the clients that I'm working with right now in a more effective way. And second, it helps me showcase my thought leadership and practice it, to be honest, to really grow my influence online. So this podcast has not been designed to optimize sales. So I know that if I do need to make the podcast become my main source of sales generator or warming up the leads to buy, I know that I will need a completely different content strategy. And so which brings me to the last point, which is I've been able to secure clients just by showing up. And it doesn't mean that it has been exclusively through my podcast. Yes, my podcast expertise, and I'm talking about things that I'm doing on the podcast, but I've been recently able to secure a new client through guesting. She was a guest on the show. We remain in contact. I continue to be visible. And then I reached out because I knew that she was going to be creating a podcast. I was like, hey, how's it going? Now, how's that podcast coming in along? And then she said, actually, I would need help for setting up the strategy and getting this podcast idea out of my head and very concrete. So all of these things happen because I'm not hiding in a corner and going, well, I'll have my podcast. I'll let my podcast do the thing. No, you have to be visible. And I'll say, some of the most exciting opportunities that I had with brands, podcasting brands, and opportunities to work with really exciting clients came from being visible online, being visible on LinkedIn, being visible on Instagram. And so to me, I want you to think about this. Creating a podcast that is successful, if you want it to elevate everything else that you're doing, you have to own the show. And you have to promote yourself and you have to talk about the things that you're doing. You can't just create a podcast and expect people to flood in through the gates and be a raving community. You have to pick one social media channel and talk about the things you're doing. Just like Gary Vee says, document, don't create, right? And if you do search for podcast discovery problem, you will find an endless amount of articles talking about how podcasting has a discoverability problem. It's great for nurturing audiences, not getting and expanding new audiences. And so for that, getting one social media channel and talk about things consistently, or getting a newsletter, writing a newsletter every week and promoting the podcast through that, or SEO. Ideally, if you can do all these things, all these three things, that's how you build a really meaningful brand and meaningful podcast that grows and is healthy and successful. But it's also important to understand your capacity. And that's the one thing I want to, as a added bonus, I want to talk about. So many podcasters feel really overwhelmed and burn out, sometimes even before launching a podcast, because they're trying to create everything to a standard that is executed by a team of 5. Or that is executed using a model that is not optimal for who they are, what their life looks like. And reducing overwhelm is the number one reason why people hire me. Podcasters hire me because they go, I feel like I created a monster and this is too much. Or everything else in my business is really overwhelming and I want to find a way to find the balance and have my podcast be the inception, the content that basically feeds everything else. And I go, all right, let's go. Because that is the key to create a successful podcast. Just understanding that your circumstances are not cookie cutter and need tailored help. If you feel like you need support with any of these things, just message me. I'm at the podcast space on Instagram. That's primarily where I hang out. And thepodcastspace.com has a ton of resources, guides, instant access courses, consulting time, and coaching. So if you feel like you're not too sure, visit thepodcastspace.com. You'll also be able to book a time with me and we'll discuss which strategy is best to help you remove overwhelm, launch a successful podcast that is relevant both in January and December. I've been an Xavier and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. Bye.